Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction of Mask Tools, which is a new add-on available on the Blender market. It allows you to quickly add or paint procedural effects and just provides an overall way of simplifying the texturing process in Blender. In this video I'll be demonstrating how Mask Tools is used, but I won't be covering all of the features. I do, however, plan to add a series of videos which will more thoroughly cover all of the add-on's functionality. So if you're interested in Mask Tools, then subscribe to the channel and there will be more information in the future. Let's start with a very basic example of how to use the add-on. After installing the add-on, you'll find the settings here in the sidebar of the shader editor. And here we have this drop box that has all of the nodes included in the add-on. And by default, it's set to this mask base option, so we'll click Add Shader, and then that node will appear before the principled shader. And mask base is essentially just a template that's made up of two sets of PBR texture inputs, which are color, metallic, roughness, normal, and displacement. Separating these two sets of PBR textures is a mask input and some blending options. So let's plug the color of this node into the principled shader. Now, because I have my file browser open, I can just drag some of these sets of PBR textures up into the shader editor and begin plugging them into their input sockets. Now, it's okay if one of your material types doesn't have a particular texture in the PBR texture workflow. In this instance, I'm skipping over this metallic texture, but by default, it's set to black, which means no metallic. And in fact, all of the color inputs are set to very neutral colors, like the displacement is set to a mid-tone gray. The normal color is set to a very flat normal value, so there's no consequence to not adding an input for any of those sets of textures. So now I can add my second set of PBR textures, and in this case I'm trying to separate this rough-looking yellow machine paint from this really dark epoxy primer paint texture. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use a procedural mask. Now, procedural masks don't require UV coordinates. And there are 7 different types in this add-on, many of which we'll cover in this video, but probably not all of them. But they just provide very common effects that you would see in other texturing software. And some of these can actually serve more than one purpose. The Edge Detect node, for instance, can create this cool edge wear effect, but it can also be used as a cavity mask. If we extrude one of these faces in and then use the cavity only slider, now we can turn off that effect on the geometry on the outside, and it will only affect those areas that are inset. Another great example is the dust mask, which can be used to create this dust effect naturally, or the snow-covered effect. And there's also this type slider, which switches between using the object's normals versus using just the Z direction. And this can be helpful for models that don't have enough geometry to use the object's normals. In this render, both types were used to create this snow-covered effect in the scene. So the procedural mask I want to use in this case is the Edge Detect. So we'll open up our drop-down menu, and we'll select Edge Detect and then click Add Shader. Now we can plug this into the mask input on the mask base node, and we'll see that effect. And to view it better, I'm going to Control-Shift left-click on the mask base node to add that to a viewer node. That is, of course, with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. But I can adjust these effects to get the right kind of edge wear that I'm looking for. Now that I've demonstrated the basics of how this works, I also want to talk a little bit about the workflow when you continue to use this process to texture with mask tools. So I'm going to box select everything and move it away from the principled shader, and this time we're going to add a paint mask. Paint masks allow you to paint these procedural textures and then continue to edit those effects after you've painted. You can even add edge detail to your brush strokes, which is used to create some contrast between two material types or just for stylized painting. And there are 5 different paint mask types, all of which can create a very wide range of results. So let's press N again to bring up our sidebar. And in our drop-down menu, we see that we have these 5 options here that begin with paint. So I'll click this Paint Noise Type 2 option. And I'm just going to drop this right into the line leading into the principled shader. Now I can plug all of these outputs from the mask base node into the first set of PBR inputs on the paint mask node. So what this does is it basically transfers all of the texture information from this first mask setup into our new mask node. And we can begin by adding another set of PBR textures and then finding a new way to mask those. I'm going to use this base metal texture. And in this case, we actually do have a metallic texture for that metallic input. So we're using 4 of the 5 texture types. We're not going to use displacement in this example, but we are going to talk about displacement textures later in this video. Now, unlike the mask base where we masked with a procedural mask, this time we just need an image texture to paint on. So we'll type Shift A and go to Texture and choose Image Texture, and then we need to click on the New tab, and I'll just call this metal_paint. And we'll keep the color as black and we'll click OK. So now we'll plug this into the paint mask input and we're ready to paint. But before we do that, Blender has always had some limitations in regards to its speed in the viewport while you're in texture paint mode painting. So I'm going to Control-Shift left click until the mask output is connected to a viewer node. And again, this is just to speed things up for the sake of the video, but you certainly can paint in textured view, which is quite a lot of fun actually, especially since you can plug these the bump value in and see all of that detail coming to the surface as you're painting this effect. Now I'm going to click on this Texture Paint tab, which will take me into the Texture Painting workspace. And I'm not going to need my UV image editor, so I'll switch it to the shader editor so that I have all of these options here on the node itself to adjust the effect. And there are a few crucial things you need to do before getting started. For instance, we need to turn off the overlays, and we need to click on Textured View. Otherwise, you won't be able to see that paint effect happen in the viewport. So those 2 steps are very important. Next, we need to make sure that we have the texture selected that we just created and plugged into the paint mask. We need to make sure that our strength is all the way up and that we're painting in a value of pure white. And lastly, and probably most importantly, under fall off, we need to choose this 4th selection here, which probably seems like a very odd requirement, but this fall off has the softest edges, or the biggest gradient between its values. So that's very important so that the procedural noise fades along the edges of the brushstrokes. So let's go ahead and paint something on our model, and you can see that that doesn't look very impressive yet, but once we start using the scale, distort, and refine values, then we start seeing these effects. And once you have the effect the way that you like it, you can just continue to paint that onto the model. In this case, I'm trying to simulate some areas where the paint has peeled off completely and exposing that, that metal texture underneath. And again, I can continue to adjust these effects until I get them just the way that I like them. And now that I can go back to my image editor now because you need to save this texture. That's very important because if you leave Blender and come back, that information will be gone unless you've saved it. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like in the through the principled shader. And it looks good, but we still don't see all of that information yet, all of the metallic and roughness and normal maps in the viewport yet, because we only have the color plugged in. But that's fine because we're going to continue working. I'm going to duplicate this mask base node, and I'll just drop this into the line. Then, just like before, we're going to connect all of these outputs into the inputs on the new mask base node. And now I can add a second set of PBR textures for that second group of inputs. And then we'll mask them out again with another procedural mask. And in this case, I'm using these this set of dirt PBR textures. One of the things I really like about working with mask tools is that it keeps you working directly in front of the principled shader. So, now that I'm going to add more masks, I can just box select everything, move it off to the side, and then again, just continue working directly up front of the line. So I'm going to add another procedural mask, and this time I'm going to use the Grunge Deform Mask. So I'll just move this back and then plug it into that mask input. Now by default, the contrast is set very low, so we can adjust it by just increasing it here. And we also have these scale sliders and distortion sliders, which can help to create a very organic looking type of grunge. So something that would apply to, dirt or moss or something similar. So I like this pattern quite a lot. And now that I do, if I were to say, if I wanted to adjust the contrast now, you could do that, but it keeps its shape, but it loses a lot of that variation in value. So what you can do instead is directly on the mask base node, you have these blending options. So I can increase the blend to make that texture underneath come through, and I can also choose to lighten or darken that value. And the great thing about masking this way is that that grunge effect isn't just happening over the yellow paint texture that we added first. It's happening over everything that we've already done. So it's going over the metal texture that we painted on as well. So it works similarly to the way that photo editing software like GIMP or Photoshop work with a layer system, but instead of working from top to bottom, we're working from left to right. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly add one more mask, and then we're going to move on to some of the other features in mask tools. So I'll duplicate this mask base again, move everything aside to create a little more room. Then one last time, I'll plug in these outputs into the new mask base inputs. And this time I'm going to add this moss texture. And what I'd like to do with it is I'd like to simulate the effect that moss has accumulated around his feet and his legs. So if I click on my drop-down menu and select Z Grunge Mask, then add shader. Now let's plug it into that mask input. And you can either view this through the mask base, or you can just add the mask itself to a viewer, which is sometimes more helpful. So let's make some adjustments here. The Z Grunge Mask has a slider called Layer 2, which allows you to add an additional layer of sort of speckled splatter along with it, which I think looks kind of nice. Okay, so we copied that mask base over, which also copied the blend value from the previous node. So that's important to keep in mind, but I actually do want that to be blended some so that it shows still some of that yellow paint underneath. And as you can see, we've been working in this very linear or horizontal type of workflow that keeps everything nice and organized. And it allows you to go back and check to see how all of these masks have been layered. And once you're finished texturing, all you have to do is plug the remaining outputs into the principled shader. It's important to note that with the normal output, you still need a normal map node. And aside from the normal map information, I can also add some bump detail. The base mask node and the paint masks all have bump outputs, and this is because oftentimes while the mask itself is just two values, black and white, the bump values has a larger range of values, creating that height information, which I'll demonstrate that in a moment. But first I'm going to add a few bump nodes going into the normal input on the principled shader. And the first bump detail I'm going to add is for this Z Grunge, because I want that moss to look like it's coming off of the surface a little bit. Okay, that's good. So we see a little bit of shadow detail there, and I like the way that that looks. And next I want to add a little bit of shadow detail to that chipped paint. So I'm going to grab this bump node and I'm going to drag it all the way back to the paint mask. And as I mentioned before, the bump outputs often have a lot more range and values. So this is because, when you're painting grunge on an object, you tend to think of things like mud and dirt and moss and rust and all of these different materials that would require that kind of height information. So it's not really going to work in this instance for what I want. However, if I take a look at the mask output, well, that's just two values, so it's black and white, which would create a much better result. So if I put that into the height info and check the invert box, because of course we want that to be flipped around, we want it reversed. Now we can take a look at this in rendered view and see how it looks. Okay, and now I see a little of that shadow detail along the edges, which creates that chipped off paint effect, which looks pretty nice. You can also do some pretty cool things with the bump values from the paint mask nodes, such as plugging them into the material displacement. In this case, I created these tree roots with one simple brushstroke. If you should decide you want to bake your textures, which I would strongly recommend doing, you'll find that everything's already separated for you. So if we just scroll through these outputs, we can see how everything's been separated through these masks. And unfortunately, while most features do work in Eevee, some do not. So say for instance you wanted to use the edge detect feature in Eevee, well you can't, but you can bake all of these textures in cycles and then of course use them in Eevee. Now let's take a look at some other features of mask tools. In this example, I've textured this tank with several different masks, but I want to add this leaking effect. But I only want the leaking effect to appear along the sides of the tank. To get a better look at the mask, let's plug it into a viewer node. Okay, so what I basically want to do is remove all of this white from the top, just leaving those streaks along the side. So there's a few different options here. I can use the starting point value, which will begin that effect at a different position, but because it's a very level effect, it excludes this back area, so that doesn't really solve the issue. We also have the ability to turn off any faces that are along the z-axis, and while the sides look pretty nice, there's still too much of the geometry that's still being masked, so that doesn't work well either. What I'm going to use instead is the erase mask input that's located on the mask base node. So I'll type Shift A and then choose Image Texture, and I'll just call this Erase Leaking, and I'll leave the color as black and then click OK. Now if I plug it into that input, let's take a look at the material, we can see that that's erased all of that leaking effect. So if we go into Texture Paint mode, let's make sure that we have the right texture selected, and we're going to use our face masking option. So what I want to do is I'm just going to select all of the faces that I want that mask to appear on. And of course I'm using the fill tool, not the paintbrush itself, but the actual paint fill. And I'm just going to fill that with white. And now when I save that image and go back to the layout, I can see now that that leaking has appeared only on the faces that I've selected. And this gives you a great deal of control over how your masks are applied to your models. Alternatively, you could create a white texture erase mask, which would keep all of that mask information and then paint on your model with black in any area in which you wish to remove it. Now let's talk about displacement textures. One of the most common ways you might use the mask base node is to just separate two texture types by using the fill tool in texture paint mode. I just painted some of these areas white, and that separated the concrete and the brick texture. And if we take a look at it in the rendered view, we can see that we're using a displacement map. And this is plugged into the material displacement. But what often happens in Blender when you use height maps is that your harder edges could appear pinched, or the geometry might actually intersect with itself. So there are these displacement tuning sliders which will either deflate or inflate the geometry, giving you a better result. And of course, each set of PBR textures can be adjusted separately. Let's briefly discuss image texture masks, although this will probably get a video all of its own because there's quite a lot to discuss about it. But Mask Tools does come with a number of textures, including some of these painting brushes. And in regards to texture painting, one of the benefits of painting with a mask brush is that you still have your options for mapping the textures. Here I can still continue to scale or rotate either of these two texture types. Aside from the custom brushes, Mask Tools also comes with some detail brushes, which are used for obviously creating these little details. But it also comes with seamless textures and non-seamless textures, and also some stencils. And again, texture painting with masks in Blender is something of a big subject, so it will get its own video. There's lots of features that I think a lot of people don't even know exist in Blender already. So I will be uploading one of those very soon. I'd also like to give some thanks to Blender artist The Timster for creating Node to Code, which is how I created Mask Tools. If you're interested in Mask Tools, it's on the Blender market now. Thanks again for watching.